Jeffrey Epstein was a paedophile. He was also very rich and friends with some of the most powerful people in the world. They flew on his private jets. They partied at his home on Fifth Avenue. They holidayed on his now infamous Caribbean island. We know that Ghislaine Maxwell, his ex-girlfriend and longtime fixer, trafficked young women and underage girls to that island for Epstein to sexually abuse. We also know that Maxwell, a woman, is the only person so far to be held accountable for the heinous deeds of a sick man whose crimes must have been abetted by at least some of his male friends. What we still don't know is exactly who else knew about it, when they knew about it, and why they decided to turn a blind eye. Those who knew Epstein before his conviction may have some plausible deniability. It's certainly possible they orbited his lavish world without knowing what he was really about. But what about after that? Epstein was first arrested in 2006, and in 2008 he pled guilty to soliciting prostitution from an underage girl. He got 18 months in jail, but he cut a secret deal with the US attorney that meant he avoided federal charges. They let him leave prison during the day to work from his own office, then released him 5 months early. That now looks like a massive slap on the wrist for a serial sex offender and, well, pretty much a deal with the devil. So how did he get that? And why did so many people, including Prince Andrew, the late Queen's favourite son, continue to call him a friend afterwards?
Was I right in having him as a friend at the time, and bearing in mind this was some years before he was accused of being a sex offender? I don't think there was anything wrong then. The problem was the fact that once he had been convicted,
you stayed with him.
I stayed with him, and that's the bit that as it were, I kick myself for on a daily basis, because
yeah, that was a problem. Like most of Prince Andrew's answers to the questions on this subject, it just didn't stack up. It defies credulity to claim that none of the men in Epstein's life knew that he sexually abused young women. And as more and more legal documents are unsealed, the picture gets only murkier. There are many lurid claims and emphatic denials. Documents released yesterday surfaced discredited allegations, or maybe they're not discredited. We don't really know that Epstein had sex tapes of Prince Andrew and potentially of former Presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, and even Sir Richard Branson, although his spokesman said that the claims are baseless and unfounded, and they may well be. This is exactly how conspiracy theories start and are allowed to prosper. There are many, many unanswered questions about Jeffrey Epstein and many important people who are choosing not to answer them. Well, joining me now via phone call, because he would prefer not to be seen on camera, is Jeffrey Epstein's brother, Mark Epstein. Mark Epstein, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Let me first of all ask you, what did you know about your brother? I mean, it's an obvious question, but you are his relative, his sibling. When this all came out about him, were you as shocked as everybody else, or did you have concerns about him?
Well, back in 2006, when he first got into trouble, he told me that he was getting into trouble, for what he was doing. And so I knew from early on what was happening. He told me early on.
Did you know the scale of it? I mean, obviously, he had that conviction. He served time in prison. But the sheer scale of what has emerged since...
I made it real clear. I'm not discussing anything about my brother and his charges against him. I have nothing to do with that. I wasn't involved. I have no more information. The only thing I'm interested in discussing is the circumstances surrounding his murder.
Okay, well, you say it's a murder. Obviously, it was ruled as suicide. Why do you believe that's not true?
Well, first, the actual pathologist who did the autopsy did not determine it was a suicide. They couldn't. They said it looked more like a homicide. But on the initial death certificate, on the cause of death, it said pending, meaning pending further investigation, which is proper. And then a few days later, Bill Barr claims it was a suicide. And then the chief pathologist of New York, who did not see the body, claims it's a suicide. So the question becomes, what investigating was done in a matter of days to make them come out with that determination? And it turns out that because it was called a suicide, there doesn't seem to have been an investigation. Because if you declare somebody died by suicide, there's really nothing to investigate. The only questions about a suicide is, how did they do it? Did they They hang themselves? Did they shoot themselves? Did they jump out of a window? And that's a pretty obvious answer at the time of the death. So there's no investigation was done. The EMTs that went to the prison were never questioned. The hospital personnel were never questioned. We can't seem to find the medical records. We can't get the 911 call. If this was a suicide, why are all these things hidden? And why did Bill Barr
obviously
make that ridiculous statement?
Right. Let's talk about the night that your brother died. He was found hanged. What is it about what happened that night? That's what was reported. So tell me why you think that what happened that night is so suspicious.
Okay, first of all, for 4 years we were trying to find out what position his body was in when he was found, because that's very telling. But we couldn't find out because they moved his body after he was found to the infirmary of the prison. When the EMTs were called and they got to the prison, he was already dead in the infirmary. Understand something. He had been dead for at least 2 hours before he was found. That's what the autopsy showed. And that's not a question. That's a fact. He could have been dead for 6 hours, but at least 2. Now, they said in the DOJ report that finally came out that he was found hanging. They said he was in a seated position with his legs extended in front of him. And when he was tied to the top bunk, and when they either cut him or tore him down, his buttocks was an inch and a half off the ground, which if you picture that, it means basically his entire body weight, or the bulk of his body weight, was hanging by the neck. Yes, there was probably some weight on his feet at the end of his legs, but the bulk of his body was hanging. So the mark on his neck left by the ligature is in the middle of his neck and goes straight back. If he was hanging, as they said, the ligature would have slid up high up under his chin and then went up back sort of behind his ears up to whatever he was tied to. So the ligature mark on his neck is inconsistent with the way they describe him. And another important thing is that when you die, when a person dies, their blood isn't circulating anymore. And what happens, the blood starts to settle in the body to the lowest point. Gravity just takes the blood through the tissue. So you get a pooling of the blood under the skin, which is why they tell you to never move a dead body, because they can tell a lot of things. If you find a dead body laying on its face and the back has this lividity, this pooled blood, that means the body died on its back and somebody eventually turned it over. So if you picture the way they describe Jeffrey as hanging, well, he should have lividity in the back of his legs and in his buttocks, which was the lowest part of his body.
Okay, let me ask you this. If he didn't take his own life, who do you think took it? Who killed him, in your estimation?
It's a good question. Bill Barr said that no one went in or out of the tier, so he concluded it was a suicide. But there were something like 11 or 12 other prisoners on that tier that could have went in and killed him. Now, if another prisoner killed him, it's sort of, why would they go to the extent to cover it up? It's like if you remember the case of Whitey Bulger, he was in prison and he got killed by 3 other inmates. Well, they got the guys and they prosecuted him for killing Whitey Bulger in jail. If it was just another prisoner that killed Jeff, why would they not just find out who it was and prosecute him for murder? There doesn't seem to be a reason to cover that up. Also, we can't get a list of who were those prisoners that were already on the tier. I know one was Taglione, who was Jeff's cellmate for a while. Now, the question becomes, who was on the tier that night? When were they put there? And when were they transferred out? Because I was told that after the death, a number of prisoners were transferred off of that tier to other places. So
let me ask you, Mark Epstein, let me ask you, do you believe, obviously Jeffrey, your brother, had relationships, friendships with many, many of the most rich, famous, powerful people in the world. Do you believe that, let's take this theory to a conclusion here, do you think that one of those people who may have had a vested interest in shutting him up and not talking about what he knew about them potentially, may have played a part in his death.
Yes, that's what I think happened. And then you have to question, out of the rich and powerful people he knew, who would have the ability to pull something like this off? That's another question. Who would have the ability to plant somebody in there if that's the way it was done? Who would have the ability to have the Justice Department come up with this, pardon the language, this bullshit report? In the Justice Department report, it just says that it was declared dead by the pathologist. But that's not true. It was declared undetermined by the pathologist that did the actual report. And then, for some reason,
you've claimed, Mark Epstein, that your brother had information on Donald Trump and Bill Clinton that was so incendiary that the 2016 election would have been cancelled if that information had come out.
No,
what was that information?
Wait, Piers, that's incorrect. What Jeffrey told me during the 2016 election, we were just discussing the election, just two brothers talking about current things. What he said was that if he said what he knew about both candidates, they'd have to cancel the election. So he was talking about Donald Trump, and he was talking about Hillary, because Bill wasn't running at that point in time. And Jeffrey used to sometimes tell me things about people he was with, whatever. I never heard Jeffrey say anything bad about Bill Clinton. Jeffrey always liked Bill Clinton. He admired Bill Clinton. So I don't think that, again, he didn't say he had information on Bill Clinton. He mentioned the candidates. So I want to keep the record straight. I like to keep facts out there, not speculation.
What information do you think he had on Donald Trump, for example, that could have disqualified him from that election?
I don't know any specific information, but I've also heard Jeffrey say that he stopped hanging out with Donald Trump when he realized Trump was a crook. That's on tape. I heard a videotape interview with Jeff, and he said that he stopped hanging out with Donald Trump when he realized Trump was a crook.
Do you believe that there are? Do you believe that there are these videotapes, which came out in the unsealed documents yesterday? That there are videotapes which apparently were from cameras that your brother put in place, recording famous people from Prince Andrew to Bill Clinton to Richard Branson and others having sex on tape. Do you believe that?
I've heard those stories, and it's sort of like, doesn't matter if I believe it or not. I don't know. So, again, I shy away from speculating on things I have no facts on, okay? I was told by somebody who supposedly knew that there were not cameras in the New York house. I know there were cameras around the entryways and for security. I was told there was no cameras inside. But, again, I don't know if that's how reliable. I thought it was reliable, and I don't have any reason to doubt it. But, again, I don't want to speculate. So I have no knowledge of any tapes or anything. Yeah.
Okay. Mark Epstein, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.